Ladies and gentlemen, welcome in the first episode of Muscle with Brain. My guest is Dr. Mike Israetel, and in our first episode, we will talk about a lot of things. Namely, Mike will talk about a topic which everyone is so interested between Greg Doucette and Mike Israetel. You already know what it is: training to failure. Is it a great tool to go to failure or beyond failure? And how genetics affect our bodybuilding and fitness goals. You will also have a better sight on why some people struggle to lose weight and keep it off, and why some of the athletes have bigger muscle parts than the rest of their muscles. What will be the future of fitness industry, namely supplement companies and fitness gurus, and how we can fight against stupidity. Let's find out. If you like this content, please subscribe to the channel and like, share, leave a comment, and I appreciate your support. It means me a lot. And one more thing, please forgive me if I misspelled anything or said in a very bad accent. I was very nervous. So that's it. And now let's start the show. Welcome, Mike, in the first episode of Muscle with Brain podcast. How are you today, Mike? And how things are going in Philadelphia?
I'm not sure. I can't speak to the state of Philadelphia as a whole, but things are going fine in my life. Other than the fact that my computer audio won't work. So, mysteries everywhere. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And finally, I must say it's an honor to meet you in the first episode because you were the first person who had a huge influence on me. So if someone told me 2 years ago, hey, Simon, you will have a podcast with Mike Israetel, I wouldn't believe that, actually.
Well, I'm honored to be on your show. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. So back in 2017, September, it was the first time when I found your work, Renaissance Periodization, and you were the reason why I didn't stop lifting, because I know there is a smarter way of gaining muscle. Because, in the first part of my life, when I started lifting, I went all out without knowing anything about training.
Sure, I think we all did that. Most people did anyway.
Yeah. So before we dive into the questions, I would like to tell my little story, if you don't mind.
Of course.
When I first contacted you about this podcast, I thought, why are you even going to answer to nobody like me? And when you told me, sure, I didn't even realize what I asked for, because I will have my first podcast show with one of the brightest minds in bodybuilding and fitness industry. And when you said yes, I thought many times I'm not good enough, and I wanted to back it up. But you gave me a chance, so if I don't accept it, I'm a fool, so I'm here.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, it's just having a conversation, asking and answering questions. You said that you're a nobody. That's nonsense. Nobody's a nobody. We're all just people, and we're, exchange ideas. That's about as simple as that.
Yeah. And for those who don't know who Mike Israetel is, I'm sorry for them. No, just kidding.
Oh, geez. They're probably better off.
He has the body and the mind. So he has a PhD in sport physiology, and he's a chief sports scientist at Renaissance Periodization and a former professor of exercise and sports science. Did I left out something, or
that's good enough.
Okay. So if you don't mind, I will tell my little introduce to you and for the listeners in just 2 minutes.
Sure.
So my name is Simon Ludman. I'm 28 years old. I started lifting almost 5 years ago. I'm 186 centimeter or 6'1". I started with 70 kilogram of body weight, and I'm 155 pound. So in the year of 2017, I was the first time I used proper training method. I started with 6-day male physique template from Renaissance Periodization, and I got pretty lean and pretty good results, I would say. So in the previous 1.5 years, I did a long bulking phase where I ended up 91 kilogram or 200 pound. So I'm currently in a cutting phase,
because I went too hard on the bulking. So
sure.
I'm doing a 4-day full body workout, and I use 2 exercises per muscle group. So okay,
Sounds
that's
reasonable.
Yeah, okay, that's my story. And now let's jump to the questions.
Sure.
Question number 1. Let's talk about why we can't grow unlimited muscles, and what determine how much muscle can we grow, and what myoneclei is.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, the way muscles grow, for the most part, that we're pretty sure of, is you have a muscle belly, which is the whole muscle itself, for example, the biceps, and composing that muscle belly are a bunch of individual muscle cells. These are actual cells like every other cell of the body, and they have a tendency that when you apply certain stimuli to them, to grow to some extent. Now, for what we currently know, muscle cells don't seem to undergo hyperplasia, which means they don't actually divide. They seem to just undergo hypertrophy, which is each individual cell grows to some extent. Now, that might change as research evolves. It's actually very, very difficult to measure hyperplasia. So perhaps humans have some proclivity for hyperplasia, maybe not a lot. Some animals have been shown to undergo hyperplasia under certain circumstances. But I think most of the documented evidence so far is that humans undergo hypertrophy and probably not hyperplasia to any large extent. So because hypertrophy is the primary mechanism of growth and not hyperplasia, not cell division and multiplication, but rather cell expansion, how many muscle cells you start out with is going to be to some extent a limiting factor of how big you get. So humans all have approximately the same number of muscle cells, same order of magnitude, but there's quite a bit of variance, very likely, between individuals as to how many muscle cells they have, and that's not just total over the whole body. That's per muscle group and per region of muscle group. So, some individuals, for example, have deltoids that start out reasonable looking, and then they have lots of cells in them, and then from resistance training they grow and grow and they get really big. Whereas that same individual might have biceps that just don't have that many muscle cells to start out with, which means they might be smaller to start out with, or approximately the same size relatively as the delts, but with longer training, the biceps hit their growth peak relatively early and become very difficult to grow because the cells get to a certain level of size that they can't go beyond. Now, the next question is, why can't cells continue to grow infinitely? For example, as far as I'm aware, the egg, a chicken's egg, is actually just one giant cell, right? So why can't each one of our cells get egg size and then we weigh 900 kilos? That would be amazing. But in living organisms, the nucleus is, you could say, the control center of the cell. And it's very important that the nucleus gets relatively rapid information to it and relatively rapid information from it to other parts of the cell and even to outside the cell. Now, as the cell grows bigger and bigger and bigger, the nucleus stays roughly in the middle of the cell and stays about the same size. But you can analogize this to the growth of a city. If a city is 1 kilometer in diameter, then the city council can simply live in a very tall skyscraper or have their offices there, and they can actually see the whole city at the same time. A fire department, for example, can be in a tall skyscraper or observation post and literally see any fire that starts and go put it out. Now, if a city expands to where it's 20 kilometers in diameter, it's going to be very difficult to see much of anything at those great distances. The fire department is going to have to upgrade its technology significantly, possibly start other fire stations elsewhere, because driving 20 kilometers to a fire, stuff's going to burn down by then. So the detection is a problem, and the shuttling of various communication is also a problem at great distances. Now, if you can imagine a city that's 100 kilometers wide, it's going to have multiple centers, so to speak, because at that point, the analogy continues, if you live in a city that's 20 kilometers wide, maybe you can drive to work downtown in the center city and come back within a reasonable time. Dealing with traffic maybe takes an hour to drive. And if the city's 100 kilometers wide, a lot of people just won't drive that far to go into the center city. They'll drive to other places, so other centers, so to speak, of commerce and industry will have to pop up. the analogy here for the cell is that if a cell gets too big, the nucleus gets so far away from the edges and the periphery of the cell, it has a very hard time upkeeping the cell structure, executing proper communication, and so on and so forth. So this results in something called the myonuclear domain. It's the nucleus, and however much volume around it, it can effectively control. And it's been shown relatively well that in a variety of different types of cells, there's a certain cell size they just won't go beyond, because if evolution had allowed for that size to be exceeded, you would have a lot of dysfunction on the outer edges of the cell, and then you no longer have very good cells. So for example, a muscle cell that is very, very big could start to get problems with repairing its own structures. In the periphery, those structures would be more likely to fail and or to generate less force and or to be the subjects of infection or other kind of damage. And then the muscle cell itself as a whole would be compromised. So this is a problem, which means that there's a cap to how big muscle cells can get. Now, the body has a little bit of a solution to this problem to some extent. It has satellite cells that are muscle cells, but they're relatively dormant, so they have nuclei that work very well, but just they're in a state of quiescence, which means they're basically half asleep. They sit outside of other muscle cells all around the muscle, and if a muscle cell next to them starts to grow, especially if it starts to get close to its myonuclear domain ceiling, the size it can carry with one nucleus, what ends up happening is the satellite cells will fuse with the muscle cell that's really big, donate their nuclei, so now another center of a city basically comes in and allows that city or muscle cell to expand even further. You would think, that's it, that's our solution. You can get as big as you possibly can because you could just keep donating nuclei. The problem is, it seems to be that the number of muscle cells you have that are functioning relatively fixed at puberty, and probably the number of satellite cells that's next to them ready to enter and help is also fixed. So it's like an army has its main combat force and the reserves. The reserves aren't infinite, right? So if the main combat force starts to get depleted, the reserves come in to help, but it's possible that they can get depleted too. So just the same way, if a muscle cell gets really, really big and a bunch of cells around get really, really big, the cell nuclei from satellite cells start to get donated and sucked in and sucked in and sucked in. Pretty soon, you're out. Most of your satellite cells are now incorporated, and you really just don't have that many more to incorporate. So not only are your muscle cells maxed out in size, they are now without any reserve to get any bigger. And at that point, we see what are called asymptotic gains, where you can still gain muscle, but it's very, very slow, very, very unproductive. It requires a lot of training, a lot of very hard training to grow maybe half a kilo of muscle a year or something like that. And at that point, we reach what you would call the genetic ceiling.
Yeah, great. Thank
Ta-da!
you. The second question is continuing this methodology. So why some guys have bigger body parts and why the rest of their muscles are not so big? So for example, Tom Platt or Robert Forsterman legs.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And a lot of that has to do with the number of muscle cells present and the number of satellite cells present in the various muscles and the differences. And also, it's probably likely that different muscle cells and different in different regions of the body might be differentially sensitive to a variety of external stimuli. So, for example, some muscle cells might be differentially sensitive to tension stimuli. So maybe the muscles in your quads or the cells in your quads really respond well to tension and produce a lot of hypertrophy for any given unit of it. Maybe muscles in your triceps don't nearly to the same extent as your quads. There may be differential responses to testosterone, among other molecules. So it's been shown, I think it's cursory knowledge. I don't think this is very solidified, but it makes a point well. I think that different muscles in your body have different numbers of densities of androgen receptors, for example, for testosterone. So, the more receptors you have, the more you respond to any given amount. And I think it's been shown at least once that, the trapezius muscles, the traps, might have a higher density of androgen receptors, but this by no means clear that that's uniform throughout all human subpopulations. So for example, if you take a certain amount of, to say, okay, I'm just going to get as big as possible, here we go. Your traps, for example, might have a higher androgen density, or your legs, if you're Tom Platz, perhaps, and they respond really well to this, whereas other muscles seem to not respond nearly as well, and still others may seem to respond barely at all. So I think that most of the variance is probably explained by cell number and satellite cell number, those two sums together. And then the rest of the variance, a smaller but significant part, is explained by androgen receptor density and other factors determining how sensitive a muscle is to growth versus another one. For example, a lot of folks with larger body parts report that sort of anything they do makes that body part grow, and when they don't train it much, it doesn't really shrink much, whereas other body parts or other muscle groups, if they're not trained very heavily, will shrink. Here's another interesting possibility, is that some muscles might just have a higher fractional breakdown rate at baseline than others. So, for example, your quadriceps, if they're a dominant body part, you build them up, and then once they're a certain size, they really just don't lose muscularity much, even if you don't train them very much. Whereas other muscle groups might have a very, very fast turnover rate, and that if you don't consistently train them hard, they might just really significantly reduce back down in size. Some of that has to do with fiber type in addition. So generally speaking, slower twitch fibers are not as big, and they don't respond as well to muscle growth training as faster twitch fibers. So not only are they smaller to begin with, they're also just not as likely to grow with any given unit of training. So that's another additional problem, and it's probably true that slower twitch fibers have faster fractional turnover rates than faster twitch fibers. So if you have a lot of faster twitch fibers, you're going to have a pretty easy time getting them bigger. Once they're bigger, they don't sort of really get smaller very easily, and they, because they're sensitive to training, especially to tension, a very small amount of training can keep them roughly the same size for a very long time, which is why a lot of bodybuilders with really, really big quads will train their legs once every 2 weeks and still lose no size over the period of a year while training their upper bodies more. On the other hand, if you're a slower twitch fibers, then you have sort of a problem where if you don't consistently train them and really, really take after them, then they sort of just really want to just go away. And when you do train them, they're not exceptionally responsive to training, and so the training is always very underwhelming, right? And people with not strong body parts, with weak body parts, have experienced this sort of, I don't want to say intractability, but relative difficulty of growing them. All of us who have weaker body parts, and everyone does, relatively speaking, you sort of peruse the internet once you figure out that your biceps, if they have trouble growing. You sort of peruse the internet or read bodybuilding magazines, watch YouTube videos with answers in them as to, this is going to solve your plateau, right? This is how you're going to grow much more muscle. And that's a very, you get very excited about, finally, I'm going to grow my biceps. And in almost every case, if a muscle is already not growing well based on your current best efforts, it's not very likely you're going to discover this revelatory new approach that's just going to get your weak muscles as big as your strong ones. Very unlikely. What you may do is enhance their growth to some extent, and the marginal growth improves, which is really good. But because muscles that are going to be their biggest generally start out a little bit bigger and also respond really well to training, when you have muscles that aren't on that side of the spectrum, it's going to be a tough road. So I think there's a kind of a public service announcement for people that have weaker muscle groups. Don't psych yourself out by thinking, you know what, I'm going to solve my hamstring problem forever with just a couple tweaks. Understand that your hamstrings might not grow as fast as your quads. That's okay. You still got to do your best, still experiment with different stuff, and you will get growth, and they will get much, much bigger, but don't expect it to be a quick solution or an easy road, if that makes sense.
Perfect. Thank you. Great. And in a relationship between, if someone was a sprinter in their teenage and he's most likely to have a bigger legs than the rest of their body, is there any case which is proving that?
Well, so that's an interesting question. So basically, am I correct in inferring that your question is like, if you've trained a muscle group when you were younger, does that muscle group have an easier time growing when you're older? Yeah, I don't think that's actually true. I don't think it's true at all, or for the most part, because individuals who are sprinters are a self-selected group of people whose quads were bigger or hamstrings were bigger to begin with, and very much responded to tension and training, which is why they became good sprinters. Because, if you look at any high school team that does any sort of running, or a track and field team, what ends up happening is a lot of people try out for the sprinting team, but many people don't end up actually being sprinting or sprinters. Does that make sense? Like, a lot of people will do a couple of days of sprinting, realize they're slower than shit, and then just not do sprinting anymore, which, is fine because there's more to life than sprinting. But when people say, I was a sprinter in high school, they sort of imply that the reason their legs are now much bigger is because of the sprinting. But it at least goes the other way to some extent, where the reason they are a sprinter is because their legs were more fast twitch to begin with, which means they're going to be more growth responsive, which means they're already pretty big. And then that's why they had success at sprinting and why their legs will be successful in bodybuilding. On the other hand, if someone has a muscle group that is super genetically advanced and just very, very lucky for them, and they never did any physical activity, you won't know that until they start doing physical activity. The bad news is if they start in their 20s or 30s, they just don't have as much time and as much youthful resilience to injury to grow that muscle group. So the good thing about training a muscle group a lot back when you were younger is that you put in some good training volume, and now when you switch to bodybuilding style training, you're starting from a higher base level. That's good, but how much of an advantage you have for eventual lifetime growth, or the speed at which your muscles will grow, is almost exclusively determined by genetics and not prior training history. In other words, there's nothing magical about you having sprinted that's going to guarantee bigger quads. There's one gentleman comes to mind. It's going to be difficult to find a lot of information about him on the internet if your listeners want to look him up. His name is Chuck Fought. Fought, like, is in the past tense of having been in a fight with someone, I believe. And he was a lifter back in the West Side Barbell Club about 10, 15 years ago. From what I understand, he did zero high school sports. Okay, he just was a fat person that played video games. And then he started lifting, I believe, when he was like 18 years old, maybe 19. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had deadlifted 900 pounds, right? So he had unbelievable gifts for muscle growth. And by the way, he did this at a body weight of roughly 340 pounds.
Wow.
So he was big and fat, and then he was big and muscular, right? So he had no idea he had a gift for muscle growth. And I'm sure there's tons of people that played track and field and deadlifted 300-400 pounds that thought they were stronger than him when they were in high school, and they're probably right. But then he was at such an adaptive level that as soon as he started, everything just took off. So I think that if you take away the genetic variance, having sprinted or having done something in high school, gymnastics or whatever, is some decent quality training time for your legs to grow a little bit more. So they start at a higher base level. Like if your quads are already pretty big from running, you just have to grow them on top of that from lifting once you start lifting after high school. But there's nothing very special or anything special about having put in that kind of training that makes you more sensitive for muscle growth later on. As a matter of fact, because you've already accustomed to some training volume and gotten some growth, you're probably less sensitive to training than you would be if you had waited and done nothing with the same genetics. You would get faster noob gains if you had never run. Now, faster noob gains means from a lower level, so it's good that you ran, but ideally, if you really want to be the best bodybuilder of all time, and you sort of know this at age 12, and there are some people that did, getting right into training for bodybuilding at age 12 is the best idea, not spending your time sprinting, which does grow your legs, but highly suboptimally compared to distinct directed bodybuilding training.
Yeah, great. Perfect. Okay, question number 3. In a case scenario when someone was slim and skinny, between 15 to 18 years old, will they significantly struggle to put on more muscle than someone who is obese? But I think you already answered this question, so you can skip
I don't
this.
know.
Or
I don't know. I don't think I answered that question.
Do you have anything to add to this?
Sure. So, I mean, if someone is by skinny you mean lower in muscularity and in body fat.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So, the somatotypes, endomorph, ectomorph, all that stuff, it turns out that's just not true. There's 3 somatotypes, but there's actually 4 poles on the 2 axes of body composition. The 2 axes are degree of muscularity and degree of adiposity, how much body fat you have. So it's possible to have essentially everyone will have genetics that fall somewhere on this planar spectrum, right? So it's a plane, 2 axes, and there's 4 extreme corners that we could hypothesize and in fact observe individuals occupying. Everyone's somewhere in the middle-ish, but there are definitely extremes in a sort of normally distributed shape about the middle. So let me sort of get on this for a second. The best genetics possible is to be on the side of this sort of square plane in which you have the maximum muscularity and the minimum adiposity, right? There are people that their genetics just make them as jacked as possible and as lean as possible. They try to put on body fat, they can't. They'll eat more food and not train and just gain muscle. This actually happens with teenagers all the time. We hate those people, right? Because none of us are those people. Then you can have individuals that are prone to both high degrees of muscularity and adiposity, right? People that have no problem putting on muscle, but also no problem putting on fat. It's difficult for them to lose fat, but also difficult for them to lose muscle, so on and so forth. There are individuals on the skinny side, and so far we're talking about the 3 somatotypes, right? Endomorph, ectomorph, mesomorph. So the third type is individuals that are very not prone to putting on muscle and not prone to putting on fat. So that would be the category you just described of just skinny, right? And they try to put on muscle and it's really tough. And they try to put on fat and also really tough. Or luckily for them, and very few people try to put on fat, right? Luckily for them, they just don't get very fat. You've seen kids like eat cheeseburger, play video games, and they still weigh 60 kilos at 190 centimeters. And you're like, what the hell? Where does all of that go? What the hell is going on with your body? And then they try to weight train and they're just weak, and nothing happens. You're like, nah, I'm sorry, right? So that's an extreme corner. Now, here's the unfortunate thing is the somatotypes missed one of the corners. The corner of death, so to speak, that is when you have a very low proclivity to gain muscle and retain it, and a very high proclivity to gain body fat, and a very difficult time with reducing it. Okay, so there's a term for that in the United States called skinny fat. I don't know if you've heard it before.
Yeah.
Applies to hipsters, I think, in general. I'm just kidding, but seriously. So what ends up happening is, it's good. It doesn't suck because you could actually just be a computer programmer and look after your health and make tons of money and be super happy and be with your friends and have a great life. All this muscularity business is just a hobby for most of us, right? So it's not the end of the world by any means, but if you are endeavoring on developing an excellent physique, you just been dealt a really, really nasty hand. So so that's the sort of topography of the situation. When we zoom back out and ask the question of, if someone has shown that they are skinny, and are they going to struggle to put on muscle mass for the rest of their lives? On average, yes. However, there's a very big difference between adaptive potential and untrained current state. So some individuals, many individuals, have unbelievable amounts of satellite cells hidden, and their baseline muscularity of their actual cells is just not very high. But those cells are crazy responsive to training, and they just can't wait. So, for example, Flex Wheeler, who I'm sure you know is one of the greats, he used to have a nickname. They called him Skinny Kenny Wheeler, because he was skinny his whole life until he started training and eating and forcing food down his throat. Then he became one of the most muscular people of all time. Nobody could have told you that was going to happen. But there is a sort of dormant ability for many people to put on tons of muscle, and their skinniness can be an illusion. And the contrary is also true. Some people start out with relatively large baseline muscle cell size, but not so many satellite cells and not a very big adaptability with tension, metabolites, and cell swelling stimuli for training, essentially. So they'll be pretty jacked in high school for no reason at all, and they'll lift weights and get much more jacked. And you're like, wow, this guy's going to be huge. And then they keep training, and that skinny guy passes and exceeds the originally jacked guy. And then the originally jacked guy kind of always stays jacked by high school standards. Something like, they're maybe 80 kilos lean in high school, which, for high school is really impressive. But then other individuals who might have started at 70 kilos lean, very dedicated to the body and lifestyle, eventually they get to 80 kilos, 85, they get to 90 kilos lean. And that other individual who's 80 kilos lean in high school maybe only ever gets to 82 and a half and 85, and that's about it. So what I'm saying is, if you are skinny to start with, do not despair. You may eventually end up very, very muscular. You got to try it. And there's no way to know, unfortunately. There's no genetic test currently that tells you reliably if you're going to be a high adaptive proclivity for training, but you got to try it. You got to train. And here's another big one from a more practical aspect. You have to eat. Not just eat regular food and I'm full. You have to eat just like you did in your last mass phase, Simon, the infinity bulk. You have to eat with the purpose of eating more food than you want. A lot of individuals who are skinny are not skinny because of an endemic genetic muscular limitation that says you don't have enough satellite cells, or your muscle cells aren't big enough, or your anabolic sensitivity is low. A lot of them are skinny just because they just don't have big appetites, and they have a very reflexive appetite where when they try to eat even slightly more food, it shuts down on them completely. I'm sure you've stared at a couple of meals before at the top of your last bulk where you were like, man, why the hell am I even doing this? I don't want to be here. I don't want any more rice. A lot of times when individuals think, oh, I'm skinny, I can't gain weight, I tried training, they never try dedicating themselves to willfully, purposefully hypercaloric periods where they do what it takes to gain weight. The way you find out, really find out, if you don't have it in you to gain a lot of muscle is you do everything pretty well. You do it for multiple years. I would say at least 2 to 4. Dedicate yourself and purposefully, at a reasonable pace, put on weight. If at the end of that period you've put on largely body fat and very little muscle, you know you don't have very good genetics for muscle gain. Then you know reasonably you're not going to be Mr. Olympia. But a lot of people assume that they're that person and they've never gained weight. Some people will say like, hey, I want to get more jacked. Like, what do I do? And I'm like, well, how much do you weigh? They're like 70 kilos. I'm like, you got to weigh 80. They're like, 80? That's a lot. I'm like, name someone who's jacked at 70 kilos. That's physically impossible because you only weigh 70 kilos. It's crazy, right? Like, it's like, how do I make my car bigger? Well, you're going to have to add parts to it to make it weigh more. They're like, well, I don't want my car weighing more. Well, you said you wanted it bigger. Like, well, I guess I just meant I wanted, I don't know. They don't know what they mean. So if you are really, truly intent on finding out if you have good genetics, you got to try to get bigger and successfully get bigger. If you do, and it's mostly body fat, yeah, your genetics are not that great. But if you do, and it's a lot of muscle mass, it's just going to be tough for you to eat. Eating is your problem, not in a sort of internal genetics for muscle limitation and so on and so forth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you measure, how did you gain any kind of lean body mass when you, for example, if you put on 20 kilogram of body weight, how can you measure that you gained lean body mass or just fat?
Yeah. So there's a couple ways. The easiest one is visual. You can tell when you're bigger because your muscle shape starts to pop out. Like when someone gains 20 kilos and people go, you're huge, that's a good sign. If you gain 20 kilos and people are like, oh, the holidays really hit you, huh? And you're like, God damn it, I just got fat. And then it's not just what other people say, you kind of know. If you're looking really puffy around the midsection, but your arms and chest don't look any bigger, maybe you have a problem. Especially in your beginner years, it should be pretty apparent to you when you get more muscular because things will start popping out of your body that didn't used to pop out. However, that's just one of the indices. I would definitely use that one. The scale we're already using. We know we gained 20 kilos. The mirror, are we looking, more jacked? And lastly, probably a very important one is repetition strength on the exercises. if you gain 20 kilos of weight and 10 kilos of that was muscle, your strength will be revolutionized. You will be a completely different person. 10 kilos of muscle makes you so much stronger. It's difficult to put into words. If you only got a little bit stronger, you gain 20 whole kilos, you're not gaining a whole lot of muscle. For example, nowadays that I'm, sort of very advanced, I've been training for 20 years. When I gain 10 kilos, which I occasionally do, I get very, very small strength improvement. So what is the answer there? I just don't gain that much more muscle because I've gained almost all the muscle that I'm going to gain, pretty close to my career peak, right? Still got muscle to gain for sure, and I'm still getting considerably stronger, but it's nothing crazy, right? But if you're training for the first year or first 2 years of your career and you put on 20 kilos, your strength is going to be completely out of this world different. You're going to go from benching 60 kilos for sets of 10 to 100 kilos for sets of 10, and people will be like, oh my God, you're a completely different person. It's sort of pretty obvious at that point, right? So if you're looking different in a good way, if the scale is moving up, and if your repetition strength for the lifts is going sky high, you're getting a lot of muscle. If all those things are moderate, you're getting some. If you honestly gained weight for 6 months and you gained like an average of 2.5 to 5 kilos on every lift for reps, either you're real advanced, you did something really wrong, or your genetics just really aren't that great and you might not be the most jacked person of all time.
Yeah, great. Perfect. We can go to the question number 4, diet genetics. I've seen so many people struggle to lose weight and keep it off. Is there anything like fat loss genetics which determine how relatively hard we need to work than the others?
Absolutely. I think one of the best summaries of this is through James Krieger, through the Weightology website. I would encourage people to go look into that. He's written extensively about that. Some individuals have the biggest difference is the non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So some individuals just don't really move around or aren't really jittery. So they just don't eat that many calories to begin with, and they're of a certain body weight. Let's say they're over fat. Those individuals, when they lose weight, the ones that have the hardest time losing fat are often the ones in which the non-exercise activity thermogenesis, how much they move around sort of subconsciously, is already low, and it drops a lot when they start losing weight. Their body goes into, for lack of a better term, quote unquote, starvation mode. But it does so, everyone's body can go into that mode where, you're cold all the time, you barely want to move, your hunger is through the roof. There are genetic differences to how quickly some people enter that mode than others, right? And when some people their bodies are very resistant to dieting, and they just don't, every time they try to diet, their diet is sort of the good results phase of the diet is cut very, very short. There are tons of other genetic influences. For example, there is a normal distribution about how warm the average person is, how much heat they put out. Most of the way you put out heat is cellular activity, actually all of it. And a lot of that is involving fat burning. I mean, the way you increase thermogenesis is just burning more substrate, and a lot of that substrate comes from fat. Some people just genetically walk around at something like below average body temperature, and thus they just don't burn much fat sleeping or sitting around or anything. Other individuals might have a slightly higher body temperature walking around, and they just burn more calories when they sleep, when they eat, when they do anything. And those individuals tend to be much leaner, and when they try to lose weight, they tend to lose weight really, really quickly. There's a bunch of differences like that on the physiological side. On the behavioral side, the differences are at least as big at describing who succeeds and who doesn't from diets, probably bigger if I had to bet. So what are behavioral differences? Not everyone is capable of executing a strict diet to the same degree. Some people have genetically a more likely probability of cheating on their diet. They're just not as consistent with their diet. A lot of that is not just genetic, it's sociocultural, and a person's individual psychological journey has a lot to do with it. But when we take a look at the variation in weight loss from a given calorie deficit in the population that's free living, just normal people walking around, it's enormous, right? But if we take people into a metabolic ward, we essentially don't let them eat anything other than what we feed them, the variation still exists, but it gets cut by a huge fraction. So from that, we know that when people say, well, yeah, I did this diet and it didn't work, I believe that you did something, but how consistent you were with it is not very clear. And we know also from tons of evidence in psychology and nutritional sciences, people lie a lot about what they eat all the time. People lie differently, so some people lie a lot more than others, and some people don't lie at all. But some people exclusively lie and will tell you, I tried this diet and it didn't work, and they just never really tried anything at all. So I think psychology has to be factored in. When most people do a diet and they stick to it diligently, they're going to have some pretty good results. So some people won't have very good results, but they'll still have results. Some people have excellent results. But before you analyze the effect of the diet, you have to realize that most people, when they say, I'm doing a diet, there's a big variance about how hardcore their adherence is, and that has a lot to do with their success.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, but I will say really quick, sorry, there is a genetic component to the degree to which you're going to be sticking to your diet. So when people say, well, it's not just genetics, it's mental, 50% roughly of your mental capacities, if not more, are genetic. So some people just genetically are not super interested in sticking to a diet, which is has to be considered. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask, do you have still time? Because we spoke 1 hour.
I have another 15 minutes.
Okay, great. So we can continue to the question number 5. Yeah, nutrition intake on diet. Why high protein intake required even when you're losing body fat? What is the least minimum protein and fat intake recommendations while you're losing fat?
Yeah, so it depends on a couple scenarios. Generally, you want roughly a gram per pound of fat, or 2 grams per kilo, something like that. Or sorry, of protein, and something like 0.6 grams per kilo of fat per day to upkeep hormonal and other factors, and that's like 0.3 per pound. So if you weigh roughly 200 pounds, that means 200 grams of protein on average per day and something like 60 grams of fat. I mean, is there a lot of wiggle room about those figures? Yes, but those are average figures. And one of the reasons you have to keep protein high when you're losing weight is because, from an evolutionary perspective, your body's not so interested in maintaining an extra level of muscularity that you've engineered for yourself. It's not really critical to your survival. So when the body notices in a variety of its systems that there's not enough calories to go around, it has no problem pulling muscle away and burning it for energy. Because if you have a ton of skeletal muscle that's not really useful to your body for survival, and the liver needs extra energy to upkeep its health and vitality, it's no problem for your amino acids to be broken off your muscles and shuttled to the liver for use, for sure. So you have to give extra amino acids via protein in your diet to make sure that if your body says, fuck, I need more amino acids somewhere, it looks and boom, there's amino acids in the bloodstream from your diet, because otherwise it will take them from your muscularity.
Yeah, great. Perfect. Question number 6, the future of fitness. How the future will change the physical exercises? Do you think knowledge and education will stay secondary and physics stays the primary driver of selling products? For example, Instagram influencers selling fat burners, fat diets, and fit tails. What do you think on that?
So, there are always advances in technology and knowledge. And if they can be diluted down to an easily consumable product that requires little effort, they will advance the average state of practice in the field. So, if you have something that is a pill or a powder or a very simple program or an app people can use, and it works super well and it's based in quality science, then it will increase the average results in the average scientific utilization through the fitness industry. On the other hand, if you have enhancements in technology or enhancements in knowledge that are very nuanced, difficult to understand, even more difficult to sort of put into practice in a program, you're going to have a very low rate of acceptance of such advancements, and the average individual will see very little benefit from them. In addition to that, fundamentally, most of us live in very free societies. And in free societies, commerce is undergone via essentially capitalism. And capitalism is a supply and demand function. Corporations are interested in selling you things that you want and are willing to pay for. And that really means that in all, it's just also called by some people, some detractors, interestingly, what's called consumer capitalism. I'm not really sure there's another kind of capitalism, but that's another discussion altogether. And it really is driven by the consumer. So for example, you could see there's big factories that produce plastic. You could ask why, who's telling these people to produce plastic? Well, the only reason they produce it is because they sell it and to plastic manufacturers, which make things like cell phones out of in part plastic. And the only reason they're making cell phones is people say, like, I want a cell phone. Here's $1,000. I want to buy a cell phone. Who's going to take my money? I want $1,000. Let me make the cell phone out of plastic and sell it to you. So the same thing happens in fitness, where if people demand, and demand in economics is known as able and willing and ready to pay, if people demand very quick solutions and they don't care about the scientific backing of solutions, if they're easy to fool, they will get exactly supplied to them what they demand. So you asked about fit teas. The only reason people actually sell fit teas is, well, wait for it, because people can buy them. If you have a demand for a tea and you can say, hey guys, we have this tea that makes you lose fat. People like drinking tea. People like really quick solutions to big problems that are cheap and easy and convenient. And they don't like nuance for the most part. They don't like scientific education. And they don't like to do things that are difficult and uphill. So when they're browsing things that they can reduce their body fat with, they look at tea, and a lot of people will be like, oh, fit tea, that's great. They are going to buy it. Now, the fact that it doesn't work at all is an interesting fact, but most people don't really parse things by whether or not they work. They parse them by whether or not they perceive to work. And how do you know if something works or not? Well, you got to have some science behind it, or some very reputable case studies or something. And most people just don't give enough if they don't use those filters, right? A similar idea to people that buy race cars to drive around every day, buy a Ferrari. Like, do you actually need a Ferrari to go to work? No. So what's the point of buying a Ferrari? Well, they like it for some other reasons. So fit teas don't actually work to lose body fat, but people like them for other reasons, because they think they'll work, because they're convenient, because they're super easy, because of clever marketing that says, hey, they work. But again, all the clever marketing in the world doesn't do a thing if you have a remotely interested and educated consumer, right? Someone could ask just one question, like, how do I know the fit teas work? And the marketer would be like, well, look at all these before and after photos. And like, yeah, but these people could be successful for a variety of other reasons. Is there data? Is there any kind of laboratory that tested it? And what would the fit tea person say? Nothing. They got nothing, right? So I don't know, right? I have no idea. So as long as people are willing to consume products and be lied to, then we're going to have these products around, and they're going to get even more clever with their marketing, so on and so forth. But there is a very, very big silver lining to all this. I'm not sure if you're interested in this discussion specifically. As biotechnology continues to advance and pharmaceutical advances occur, we're going to have a revolution, probably within the next 10 to 20 years, maybe sooner, of very advanced drugs and genetic therapies that will probably solve, with a capital, a variety of problems that we've considered intractable forever. For example, if you have, there's nothing physiologically to counter a potential drug or genetic therapy that shuts your appetite down so much you actually have to be reminded to eat. If such a drug exists and is safe, or a genetic therapy, even better, permanently reduces your appetite, almost everyone's going to be in shape, right? We could have further enhancements that enhance muscularity and so on and so forth, to where, these quote unquote problems we used to have are just not going to be problems anymore. And I do really think that the pharmaceutical industry and the genetic engineering and biotech industry are at the cusp of making a lot of these things happen. And once they start happening incrementally more and more and more, I think the landscape of the fitness industry is going to change significantly. And I think that's going to be a great thing, because people can finally take one pill to sort of cure obesity. I think that's coming. There's no reason to suspect it's not. And I think that is going to put all the fit tea people out of business. It's also going to put a lot of personal trainers and stuff out of business, which is also good, because then we can get busy on solving a ton of other humanities problems. Getting, fat people into better shape is a problem, but compared to like landing on the moon or solving global warming, there's bigger problems.
Exactly. Perfect. Yeah. Question number 7. I think you wanted this question from your bottom of your heart.
Okay.
Greg Doucette's training method. So I take some notes from his previous videos.
Okay.
So he trained his chest 3-4 times per week, and he has a repetition goal of 10, and goes to failure every single time. He put up an example training. He do training with 500 pounds for 10 deadlifts. Then on the next set, he lowered the weight by 10%. So he do 450 pounds for 10, then lower the weight by 10 again. And he also states that if he unable to do 10 reps with 405 pounds, you are done, you go home. Next session, add more load or add more reps. So the question is how still he can recover from this kind of training method. And I also created a little bit of diagram here. And my understanding is he skips the week 1 and week 2 part. So the easy gains, he's skipping that, and he jumps right over to the 4 and 5 week without deloading in my understanding. So how he can still manage to be recovered, and yeah, what's your opinion on that?
Sure. So recovery is a matter mostly of total volume, and it doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like the total volume of his weekly program is very high. So the recovery might not be a very big deal. I also don't really understand if he's doing any other exercises for back, like on a deadlift day. Like, okay, he has a formula for how he determines the volume of a single exercise. I haven't heard him speak as to how many exercises he does per session, or is it just one? I don't know. If it's just one, who knows? Okay, that seems fine. If it's more than one, how does he come up with what's more than one? It's a pretty decent method because it has some auto-regulation in there. It's pretty good for fiber type alignment for training. So, for example, if you're very fast twitch fibers, they probably don't need as much training volume as slower twitch fibers. So, but they also have a very high fatigability. So they drop below rep equivalency at 10% or at 90% load. Fast, so you might only do 2 or 3 sets of faster twitch fibers, but slower twitch dominant muscles might need 5 or 6 sets to drop below. So that's cool. Question of 10% is, I don't know if that number's been pulled out of thin air or been, experimented with for a long time. There's certainly no good research confirming that that's a good idea. It's not based so much on the auto-regulated feedback of what your body's actually doing. So, for example, like, what if you're still violently sore? Do you still go train? What if you're barely getting any stimulus at all, but you just have a high degree of fatigability for whatever other reasons? Maybe it's just not enough volume for you. So it's auto-regulated in one sense, but in auto-regulated to the body's actual needs for and limits of adaptability for hypertrophy, it doesn't seem to be auto-regulated at all. So there's also, as I mentioned, the question of how many exercises you're doing. There's just one. The other question is, going to failure, is it a good idea? Most of the research says it's a fine idea, but it's not necessary. You can go several reps away from failure and get very comparable results. Also, it's very, very clear that the fatigue generated by failure training is exponentially higher than what it is by submaximal training that gives you roughly the same benefits. So why he would consistently go to failure and then sum up that much fatigue is another big question. How he recovers from that is probably because of this 10% drop formula. It keeps his volumes intentionally lower. And the lower volumes, coupled with the high fatigues, end up giving a moderate level of fatigue. So it's not, a crazy cumulative fatiguing way to train. But he could get more benefits and less downsides if he increased his volume but decreased his proximity to failure. Increased his proximity to failure, so he didn't go all the way to failure. And if he, went a couple reps shy of failure but did a couple more sets, he'd probably grow more and fatigue less, which means he could grow more for longer. So that explains it. And then, of course, genetics is a big factor. Not everyone's Greg Doucette. He has exceptional genetics. So, and in addition to this, he may be recovering at whatever level. If he did things better, he would recover better and have better results. So it's a system, so to speak, if it's very charitable to call it a system. His approach is, not a terrible approach, but it's not the greatest approach, and it doesn't seem one that's been particularly deeply thought through.
Perfect. Yeah. continuing on Greg's takeaway, he also says that scientific training method is good for intelligent, educated people, but I don't think Mike's information will be good for the average person who doesn't have a science degree. My takeaway on this: if someone don't know how to train properly, he or she should train. He shouldn't train any differently than the educated people who knows how to train, basically.
Mm-hmm. So I think there's a good point in there somewhere about not overcomplicating training advice, and I think that a person who is not of a very high intellect is going to have difficulty with very nuanced, very specific, very granular recommendations. But I think a lot of the smartest people actually make training programs and advice that's very easy to understand. For example, if you take Greg Nuckols and Omar Isuf's The Art and Science of Lifting books, and if you have a, I don't know, 7th grade reading level, you can understand pretty much everything in those books. And they tell you things like, and you get stronger, add weight. If you're doing this volume and you don't feel anything, do more. Stop a few reps shy of failure. I actually don't know anyone outside of maybe young children who are so unintelligent as to not understand failure proximity. Everybody understands what training to failure is when they've tried it a couple times. And you can always tell people, like, hey, when you think you're about to fail, just stop a couple reps short of that. I just don't know anyone in my personal life, and I know plenty of people that I would not describe as highly intelligent, that don't understand that. It's not a very nuanced thing. So if you tell people, there is an art to breaking things down for folks that might not be super duper smart. I'm not sure what Greg considers his average viewer to be, but he actually did say in that video that he used to be a special education teacher, and that gives him a unique gift to explain things to people that are highly unintelligent. I don't know what he's saying about his viewer when he says that. Maybe he's undercutting his viewer's IQ. Maybe it's accurate. Mildly insulting, you could surmise. But nonetheless, I think that, there's a good point in there about making sure to, when you give advice, keeping it relatively simple. There's a variety of ways to do that. In addition, there are digital ways to do that where you don't actually give advice. You give someone a program with a few ratings, they can actually not think about anything. For example, shameless plug. It's just one of the many things to do this. The RP physique templates. You don't have to know a thing. You have to pick the exercise you want to do, and it says, hey, do this many reps until you get tired. You say, okay, great. And you do that for a couple sets. And then it asks you, hey, how do you feel? Are you sore? Are you tired? How sore? How tired? You just read a couple of questions. You click a button, and then it tells you how many sets to do next time. Problem solved. You don't have to do any calculations, none of that crap at all yourself. So if people really just, and a lot of people are plenty smart enough to think about training, they just don't want to. If I'm a corporate lawyer, I don't want to go on Renaissance Periodization and read about periodization and training strategies, reading the hypertrophy guides, that. I just want someone to tell me what to do so I can turn my brain off for an hour a day before I get home and my wife yells at me about a big ram and about I don't spend any time with the children. So I might just download a physique template or get onto 3DMJ and do one of their sample templates from their books. And, the Stronger by Science guys have a ton of stuff. Just anything like that. Super simple. You don't actually have to think because you just follow a real simple auto-regulated progression that asks you like 3 questions at a time and then tells you what to do. So if you're really not interested in thinking, you could do that. And that is much better than advice that's not just oversimplified, but wrong. As telling people to train all the way to failure is just wrong, and it doesn't matter how you paint it. It doesn't matter if they're really stupid. You can tell really stupid people to train a little bit shy of failure, probably going to understand what you mean. Because people are not super intelligent or invested into thinking about stuff doesn't mean you have to tell them that's wrong.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. This is actually not a question, just an answer. He also says that if you are a beginner, you can gain by looking at the weight. Actually, I trained 2 years with going to failure training, and I haven't got any good results from that. So after I managed to review my training method, I actually got better results than with the failure technique.
Yeah, well, you're one of the many, many, many people that has gone through that sort of experience. I'll tell you what, yelling at people on YouTube is all fun and games until it doesn't work for you. And then you always have to go back to thinking about things, which is why I'm not a big fan of yelling on YouTube. Greg yells at people to train harder, that may make him feel that he's hardcore or something like that. But at the end of the day, I think reasonable training advice with some options of if it doesn't work for you, what do you do? Is probably a bit better than just yelling at people, which, it sounds cool when you used to train really easy and someone yelled at you and now you train harder, now you get better results. That's awesome. Good for you. But that's not going to work for everyone. And some people already training very hard, and that's not where they can improve. Maybe they can do more volume. Maybe they can do less. Maybe their technique is a problem. Maybe their frequency is a problem. Maybe their consistency is a problem. Maybe their diet is a problem. So yes, some people undertrain, but it's not everyone, and it's probably not even the majority of people that listen to that kind of stuff. Most people who like to listen about yelling, about training harder, already train more than hard enough, and I literally mean more than hard enough. And would probably be best served by backing off of the proximity to failure, doing a bit more frequency, a bit more volume, being a bit more consistent, paying attention to their technique, and get better results with fewer hiccups and injuries and so on and so forth.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay, question number 10. I saw you on a lot of podcasts, and I would like to ask you, how can you do so many things in one day? How can you stay that productive every day? Tell me about yourself.
Gee, probably because I'm a workaholic.
But do you have a clone of a mic?
That would
so
be
you
pretty
have
cool.
A double mic?
I would fight my clone all the time. It'd be awesome. Excellent training partners. Every day I wake up in the morning, and the first thing I do is I make my to-do list for that day. And as I go through the day, I check the boxes to make sure I've accomplished what I needed to accomplish. In addition to that, I try to never schedule too many things in one day that are going to be overwhelming. So what I try to do is schedule enough that it'll keep me challenged and keep me productive, but not so much that I'm going to burn out. Once I schedule that many things, I go through them and I calmly and diligently work on them until they're completed. And then I take a breather, relax for 15 minutes, watch some YouTube videos, have a meal, have a drink of water, and then I go back and work again, calmly, relaxed. A lot of times the first 10 or 15 minutes of work is frustrating because your brain's not super into it. Once you get the flow a little bit, things you forget where time even is, and you just become very, very productive. And after a while, you go through the day, you've done all your training, you've done all your eating, you've checked everything off the list. Then almost every day, pretty much every day, I spend some time with my wife at the end of the day where we just watch television and unplug, and then we go to sleep, and I always get plenty of sleep. So I think a really good way I found to be productive is to set the kind of goals in your daily life that are going to keep you pretty well productive, nothing extraordinary, and take plenty of rest and take plenty of time to regroup and really take care of yourself, lots of sleep, so that you can consistently week after week after week be productive. And if you can do that, you're going to be crazy productive, because most people have really big cycles of really grind for a couple of days and then have weeks where they do hardly anything at all. I work very, very regularly. So pretty much every week I get plenty done. It's not a ton, but you add 52 weeks together and all of a sudden you've written 2 books and been on 100 podcasts and designed a bunch of apps and all this other stuff. So stuff adds up, and it's all about just relaxing, calming down, and quietly getting to work on very manageable chunks.
Perfect. And everyone is interested about the hypertrophy book, when it will be released.
So I'm currently about midway through drawing the graphs and figures for the book. Mm-hmm. Once I do that, the book is written. It's essentially complete. 90% of the writing has been done. All the main chapters have been written. And the main editing has been done. So Jared Feather and James Hoffman went through it and told me I was an idiot and cut out a bunch of different parts, put a bunch of different parts in. I don't know if you remember, one of my Instagram posts was from James' critique. He's like, this is some combination of superfluous and wrong. And I'm like, this is rough. So once we've already done all that fleshing out, in about a week, I'll probably be done creating the figures. I send them off to a digital artist that makes them look not retarded. My artistic skills are limited, to say the least. When he sends them back, I label them, put in axes, design the figure legends, and once we do that, pretty much covers most of the bases, except a couple here and there, and then we send it off to our two main internal RP editors, Dr. Melissa Davis, and actually my sister works for RP. Her name is Sonia. She is a professional writer, so they'll do the edits and tell me how everything that James and Jared and I said is said wrong, and we have to say it another way, and that'll be further embarrassment, and then that should take a couple of months. So I anticipate that hopefully in the springtime, the book will be ready for release. It's going to be awesome because myself and James and Jared, we've been really trying to, not perfect, really trying to get very close to very dependable, sensical answers to the questions of hypertrophy. Folks asked me to write this book 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and I literally told people I just don't know enough. Like, for example, on training frequency, per session volume, we just didn't know enough 2 or 3 years ago to write a book that made any goddamn sense. And we don't want to write a book of recommendations and fun facts that we think we know. We want to write a book that is holistic in the sense that it really has a fundamental theory of hypertrophy and that we understand the big picture in all of the phases of periodization, frequency, exercise selection, so on and so forth. We have that understanding now, and I think the book is going to be really awesome. It is designed for an advanced audience. So the first part of the book will literally say, here's books you can read before this one, and mandatory reading before the book will be Dr. Brad Schoenfeld's hypertrophy textbook. Once you've read that, then you're going to be ready to read our hypertrophy book, because otherwise it's going to be confusing but if you've had the prerequisite reading, it's going to be a really, really awesome book that synthesizes a ton of ideas about hypertrophy, hopefully does to hypertrophy training what our Scientific Principles of Strength Training book did to strength training, which is to reduce the number of questions we're asked about it significantly, at the very least.
Great, perfect. And what books are you reading currently? And do you have any recommendation, for example, a self-improvement book?
You know, I don't really read any self-improvement books because I was born perfect. But not everyone is. I'm just kidding. You know, my pleasure reading is mostly in psychology and economics and evolutionary theory, and this has nothing to do with training whatsoever. When I read for pleasure, it's to sort of take my mind away from training and sharpen my mental faculties, reading things that are more difficult for me and confusing for me to understand, so that I come back to training with a fresh face. Read a lot of books by Thomas Sowell, Steven Pinker, and recently been reading some books by a gentleman named Douglas Murray, who's a social theorist. So, you know, books like that. And every now and again, for business purposes, Nick Shaw, the co-founder of RP, will send me a book to read about digital marketing or establishing a funnel, or, you know, like recurring revenue products, subscription services. And I'll read that and understand maybe half of it. But just to make sure we're on the same sort of corporate strategy. So unfortunately, I do have books for self-improvement that I read a long time ago. They're very, very dated, but they're excellent. Dale Carnegie's How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, maybe the greatest book I've ever read. It certainly changed my life more than any other book, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah.
And where can people find you?
At RP Strength on Instagram is the company account. At RP Dr. Mike on Instagram is my personal account, where I get a little bit more funky, a lot of memes, because I like funny things and sharing them with people that follow me, and lots of knowledge. Facebook is sort of dying, but I'm on there anyway, and I put up some excerpts in the book. And then honestly, one of the good ways to find me is to simply go to the Renaissance Periodization YouTube channel, where every week my colleague James Hoffman and I, who is also a PhD in sport physiology, we have a Answer All Your Questions podcast, essentially, RP Plus webinar. And if you get on there and ask questions on the YouTube, or if you join our RP Plus community, we answer tons of questions on super, super in-depth sports science from a bunch of folks. That's probably the best place to look. And if you run through all those, you can find me in just YouTube, YouTube my name, Mike Israetel, and especially if you type in something like Revive Stronger, there's about 1 trillion episodes of me, which I would follow Revive channel also. And hey, your podcast is going to be one of these now, so when people just Google my name and podcast, boom, they'll find this ranty episode.
Thank you. Great. Perfect. And last but not least, if you like this content and that we created and you wanted to hear more like this, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell notification. If you like the video, leave a comment below. I will answer every single comment of yours. So please share with your friends. It doesn't cost you anything and it's absolutely free. And you can find the links in the description box below. Mike, thank you for your time and I wish you all the best. And thank you for having you in the first episode of Muscle with Brain podcast.
I'm honored. I think the questions were excellent, and I can't wait to share this when it comes out.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You bet.
Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.